He didn't shout. That's the part I keep coming back to. I think if he had shouted, it would have been easier to file away somewhere, easier to label. But he didn't raise his voice. He just looked at me across the dining room table. My mother was there, my brother Theo was there, my Aunt Grace had come for the weekend, and he said it the way you'd read something off a list. You can't stay here anymore. Not while you're behaving this way. You're a disgrace to this family. And then he picked up his fork and continued eating. I'm Sophie, by the way. I was 23 years old. I had just been passed over for a promotion I had worked 2 years toward, which meant I couldn't yet afford to move out, which was the source of the behaving this way. I had said, at that same table, 3 days earlier, that I wanted to leave the country for a year. Try something new. Figure out what I actually wanted. That was the disgrace, wanting something he hadn't decided for me. Okay, let me go back a bit, because I don't want you to think this came from nowhere. It didn't. Nothing in my family ever came from nowhere. It just took a long time to accumulate enough that you couldn't ignore the weight of it anymore. My father, Leonard, is a man who has very clear ideas about how things should go. Not cruel ideas, necessarily, just fixed ones. He decided early, I think, that Theo was going to carry something forward and I was going to marry into something suitable, and that was the architecture of our family. Everything else was built around that. Theo got the better school. Theo got the car at 18. When Theo changed his degree halfway through university, my father called it finding his direction. When I changed mine, he didn't speak to me for 2 weeks. When he did speak again, he didn't mention it. He just acted like it hadn't happened, which was somehow worse than the silence. My mother, Irene, is not a bad woman. I want to say that. She made her choices a long time ago and she's been living inside them ever since. She knows when to look at her plate. She's had decades of practice. And Grace, my aunt, my father's sister, she came to visit twice a year, and every time she came, she spent most of it watching. Just watching. Like she was tracking something. I never knew what she was tracking. I didn't think about it much at the time. I was too busy trying to be acceptable. So, the promotion. I had been working at the firm for 3 years by then. I was a marketing manager, junior level, but I'd taken on senior responsibilities for most of the previous year because the person above me went on extended leave and they needed someone to cover. I covered. I did it well. I have the performance reviews that say so in writing, which I kept. I kept everything. Not because I was planning something, I just have the kind of brain that saves things. Receipts, documents, emails. I've always been like that. When the promotion went to someone who had been there 18 months and had not covered anything, I asked for a meeting. I asked calmly, professionally, for an explanation. They said it was a fit decision. They said they'd keep me in mind for the next cycle. I went home that evening, and I made the mistake of telling my father. I don't know why I told him. I think I was just tired, and I needed to say it somewhere, and home was where I was. I told him I'd been passed over, that I'd asked why, that the answer wasn't satisfying, and that I was thinking about whether this was the right place for me to keep investing my energy. He said, "You need to stop being so sensitive. That's why they didn't promote you." I didn't argue. I'd stopped arguing with my father about work years ago. I just nodded and went to my room. But something had started moving in me, quietly, like a gear that had finally caught. 3 days later, I said at dinner that I was thinking about taking a year, going somewhere, resetting, maybe working abroad for a while, seeing what else was out there. He put his fork down that time. He looked at me and he said, "Is this a joke?" It wasn't a joke. What followed was 15 minutes that I'm not going to describe in full, because I don't think I can do it without it becoming something uglier than it actually was. The surface of it was calm. That's the thing about my father, the surface is always calm. But he laid out, very clearly, what he thought of the idea, what he thought it said about my character, what he thought it said about my gratitude for everything he'd provided, and what he thought it said about my chances of being taken seriously by anyone if I walked away from a stable position to find myself at 23. I said, "I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you what I'm thinking." He said, "Then think about it somewhere else." And that was it. The dinner ended. Everyone went to their rooms. 3 days after that, he called me to the dining room formally, which he only did when he wanted witnesses, and he said what he said. "You can't stay here anymore. You're a disgrace to this family." My mother looked at her hands. Theo looked at the wall. Grace looked at me. I looked at my father. I said, "Okay." Just that, okay, and I went upstairs. I want to tell you what packing feels like when you're doing it under those conditions. When you haven't been asked to pack, you've been told to. When there's no fight happening, just a verdict that's been delivered and now you're supposed to comply. It feels very quiet. That's the honest answer. People might expect that it feels chaotic or devastating, and maybe it was underneath, somewhere I wasn't accessing in the moment. But the actual physical act of it was just quiet. I took what was mine. I left what wasn't. I didn't take anything to make a point, didn't leave anything to make a point. I just took my things. I had enough saved for 2 months somewhere modest. Maybe 3 if I was careful. I was going to need to be careful. I called a colleague, Petra, someone I'd worked alongside for a year, and asked if she knew of any short-term lettings. She did. A friend of a friend had a spare room. It wasn't nice exactly, but it was clean and it was available and it was mine in a way no room in my father's house had ever been mine. I moved in on a Saturday. My mother texted me that evening. It said, "Let me know you arrived safely." I texted back, "I'm here." That was our whole conversation for 6 weeks. Here's what I did not do. I did not call him. I did not send a long message explaining myself or defending my choices or asking to be let back in. I did not show up at the house unannounced hoping something would have shifted. I did not perform my suffering for anyone in the family to see. I just got up every morning and went to work. And I started thinking, properly thinking, in a way I hadn't been able to while I was still inside his house, about what I actually wanted, not what was acceptable, not what was suitable, what I wanted. I went back to my firm and I requested a second conversation about the promotion. This time I came with documentation. The coverage I'd provided, the results, the timeline, the disparity. I wasn't emotional about it. I was just thorough. I laid it out. They offered me a revised title and a salary adjustment. Not everything I'd asked for, more than they'd originally planned to give me. I took it, and I kept looking. Because here's what being suspended from your father's house teaches you, if you let it teach you anything. You find out very fast what you're actually made of when there's no floor beneath you that someone else built. You find out whether you can hold your own weight. I could. I just hadn't been given a long enough uninterrupted stretch to discover it. 7 months later, I signed a lease on my own place. Not a spare room. An actual apartment. Small, I'm not going to pretend it was anything grand, but mine, fully mine, my name on the document, my deposit, my responsibility. I didn't tell my father. I told my mother briefly because I think she deserved to know I was stable. She said, "That's good, Sophie." She sounded, I don't know, something. I didn't push it. What I did, quietly, around this time, was start building things I hadn't built before. I took a course in something I'd been interested in for years, but had always dismissed as impractical. I started running in the mornings, not for any particular goal, just because I could, just because it was a thing I did for myself that cost nothing and owed nothing to anyone. I started keeping the receipts of my own life in a new way. Not just documents and emails, but choices. The accumulation of days that belonged to me. Theo called once, around the 8-month mark. He asked if I was coming to my father's birthday dinner. I said I had plans. He said, "He's not going to bring it up if that's what you're worried about." I said, "I'm not worried about it, I just have plans." I didn't have plans. I stayed home that evening and cooked dinner for myself and watched something I'd been meaning to watch and went to bed early. And I felt not triumphant, that's not the right word. I felt settled. The way a room feels after you've finally arranged it the way it actually works, instead of the way you thought it should look. About a year after I left, I was offered a role at another firm. Senior level. Real senior, not acting, not covering, not will consider you next cycle. A full step up with a team under me with actual authority over decisions I cared about. I took it. I told my mother. She told my father, I think, because 2 days later he called me. I let it ring. He called again the next morning. I let that one ring too. Not out of cruelty, I want to be clear about that. I wasn't sitting there watching my phone with any satisfaction. I was just busy. I was in the middle of something. And when I came back to the phone and saw the missed calls, I thought about calling back. And then I thought about what calling back would require of me, the navigation of it, the management of his reception of my news, the way his approval or disapproval of it would sit in my chest for days after. And I thought, I don't need to do that right now. So I didn't. I texted him a few days later, something brief, professional almost. I've accepted a new position, I'm well, hope you're well. He replied, good. That was it. And I realized, reading that single word on my screen, that I had spent the first 23 years of my life trying to earn more than that from him. More than good. A fuller acknowledgement. Something that said he saw me, the whole of me, and found the whole of me worth something. I was not going to get it, not because he was withholding it as punishment, but because he genuinely didn't have access to it. You cannot take from someone what they do not possess. That's not a sad thought, by the way. Or it is a little, but it's also just a fact. And facts, once you accept them cleanly, stop having power over you. My Aunt Grace called me about 14 months after I left home. She asked if she could take me for lunch. I said yes. I didn't know what to expect. She didn't talk about my father for most of it. She asked about the job, about the apartment, about what I was reading, what I was thinking about. Real questions. The kind I hadn't been asked in my own house in years. Near the end, she said, you know, I watched you that night at the table, when he said what he said, and I didn't do anything. I want you to know I've thought about that. I didn't tell her it was fine, because it wasn't entirely fine. I didn't tell her it didn't matter, because it did. I just said, I know you were there. She nodded. We didn't talk about it again, but something about it mattered. Not because she made it right, she didn't, but because she named it. She saw it and she named it, and sometimes that's the thing you didn't know you were waiting for. Christmas, this past year. My mother asked if I was coming home. I said I had plans, and this time I actually did. Petra and a few others, a dinner, a genuinely good evening that had nothing to do with managing anyone's feelings about me. My mother said, your father would like to see you. I said, I'll visit in the new year, Mom. She said, he's not going to apologize, Sophie. You know how he is. And I said, and I meant this, I wasn't performing anything. I know, that's okay. Because it was, not because what he did was acceptable. It wasn't. He suspended me from a home I had every right to be in and called me a disgrace in front of people who loved me, and none of that gets reclassified as fine just because time has passed. But I had stopped needing it to be addressed in order to move forward. He could carry that. It was his to carry. I had put mine down. I went to see them in February, spent an afternoon, had tea. My father showed me something on his phone, a video of some bird he'd seen in the garden. He'd been getting into bird watching, apparently. He handed me his phone, and we both watched a small gray bird do nothing remarkable for about 40 seconds. He said, it's a different one every morning. I said, that's something. He nodded. That was the closest we came to anything real. I drove home that evening with the radio on. Not sad, not satisfied exactly. Just present. Just myself in my car, going back to my apartment, my lease, my life that he had accidentally handed me by telling me to leave. I parked outside my building. Sat for a moment. The door he closed had turned out to be the one I'd needed to walk through. I just hadn't known it yet.